Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ways of the World, Chapter 3, State and Empire in Eurasia, North Africa. And today we're going to continue with comparing empires, particularly the Roman and Chinese. Okay, so let's start with Rome, from city-state to empire. Rome started as a small, unimportant city-state in central Italy in the 8th century BCE. But the monarchy was overthrown and a republic was established circa 509 BCE. There's conflict with the plebeians, or the poorer classes. There's a lot of pride in Republican values like rule of law, citizens' rights, lack of pretension, and morality, or the way of the ancestors. But this also led to the creation of the empire. It began in 490s BCE with wars to control the Italian peninsula. From 264 to 146 BCE, Rome fought Carthage in the Punic Wars. They conquered Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and present-day France and Britain. And this was a gradual, unplanned pursuit of opportunities. The Roman army was skillful, brutal, and quite successful. And usually there was a generous treatment of conquered peoples. Now, the empire building helped shape Roman society. Rome became a warrior society. Upper-class men, in part defined as soldiers and landowners. Husbands had absolute control over their wives, children, and slaves. Women were confined to producing warrior sons. And by the early centuries CE, elite women experienced less restriction. Women found protection in the law in areas of marriage and property rights, but there was no improvement for the growing number of slaves. Now, the empire's impact on the republican government and values was extensive. Some grew wealthy, but slaves undermined the position of common citizens. And the rise of military leaders like Marius and Sulla and Pompey and Julius Caesar brought civil war in the 1st century BCE, and that led to the decline of republican values. But under Caesar Augustus, an imperial system was established, and he ruled from 27 BCE to 14 CE. And this leads to the establishment of Pax Romana, or Roman peace. The empire was relatively secure and prosperous during this time. Okay, the Roman Empire. At its height in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire incorporated the entire Mediterranean basin, including the lands of the Carthaginian Empire, the less developed region of Western Europe, the heartland of the Greek civilization, and the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. So where were the imperial borders demarcated by geographical features like rivers, oceans, or deserts, and where were they not? Well, in the days before GPS and the exact measurements of land surveyors, imperial borders were mostly demarcated by geographical landforms that were easily identified and defended. This is evident in the Roman Empire, where a majority of the empire ended at a river, ocean, or desert. Only in the north of Britain, west of the Black Sea, and in between the Caspian and Black Seas was this not the case. Now, if you were to compare map 3.3 and 3.1 with the Roman Empire map, you might think about which regions of the former Persian and Greek empires did the Roman Empire incorporate. Well, the Romans absorbed Greece, Anatolia, the eastern Mediterranean, extending into Mesopotamia, and Egypt, lands which formerly were ruled by the Greeks and the Persians. Okay, this is Queen Paducah. This statue in London commemorates the resistance of the Celtic people of eastern Britain against Roman rule during a revolt in 60-61 CE, led by Queen Paducah. A later Roman historian lamented that, quote-unquote, all this ruin was brought upon the Romans by a woman, a fact which in itself caused them the greatest shame. So let's identify how Roman ideas on gender and patriarchy were a continuation of the ideas of first-wave civilizations. But how were Roman ideas on gender and patriarchy different from those of the first-wave civilizations? Well, some continuities include men continued to be considered the head of the family and household. Man had absolute control over his wife, children, and slaves. Women were expected to take care of the home and children. And women continued to be captured during war and sold into slavery. But some changes are thus. Upper class Roman women were not as secluded in the home as were women in other classical societies and first civilizations. Upper class women could marry without transferring legal control of their property to their husbands. And upper class women were increasingly able to manage their own finances and take part in the growing economy of the empire. Now, what political situation represented by the person in the statue shown here, Queen Paducah, was also a struggle for the Han Empire in China? Well, Queen Paducah, depicted here, represented the resistance of an ultimate amalgamation of outside people, as in the case with the Celts under Imperial Roman rule. The Han Chinese faced similar issues, especially with peoples in Vietnam, Korea, and the steppes in Central Asia. Okay. All right, China, from warring states to empire. So the creation of the empire was regarded as a restoration. The Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties had created a Chinese state, but the system fell apart by 500 BCE, and this led to the age of warring states, particularly 7 competing kingdoms. Now, there were multiple states that were regarded as unnatural. And then came the Qin Emperor Shi Huangdi, and he unified under the Qin, or Qin, dynasty, and ruled from 221 to 210 BCE. And this is when legalism is adopted as a political philosophy. Essentially, there is a clear set of rules and harsh punishments to enforce state authority. And Shi Huangdi means first emperor. Now, the expansion of the empire into northern Vietnam and Korea and into the steppes to the northwest was important. The empire formed far quicker than the Roman Empire, but no less dependent on the military force. It was brutal, including execution of scholars and book burning. Hundreds of thousands of laborers built the Great Wall, and they erected Shi Huangdi's monumental tomb. There's the standardized weights, measures, currency, written Chinese, and even axle links for carts. And the Qin dynasty collapsed in 206 BCE, followed by the Han dynasty, which lasted until 220 CE. Now, the Han dynasty maintained that Qin centralization, but they were less harsh in their rule of the empire. Okay, empires have long faced resistance from people they conquer, and never more fiercely than in Vietnam, which was incorporated into an expanding Chinese empire for over 1,000 years. Among the earliest examples of Vietnamese resistance, this occupation was led around 40 CE by Trung Trác and her younger sister Trung Nhi, daughters of an aristocratic military family. They were vocal opponents of offensive Chinese policies like high taxes, even on the right to fish in local rivers, required payoffs to Chinese officials, and the imposition of Chinese culture on the Vietnamese. Now, these girls took up arms against the Chinese occupiers and quickly gained a substantial following among peasants and aristocrats alike. And within months, their forces had captured 65 towns, and for 2 years they held the Chinese at bay. They ruled a briefly independent state as co-queens, and Chinese sources referred to Trung Trác as a ferocious warrior. During their rule, the sisters eliminated the hated tribute taxes imposed by the Chinese and sought to restore the authority of Vietnamese aristocrats. However, Chinese forces overwhelmed the rebellion and their support faded. Later, Vietnamese records explain the failure of the revolt as a consequence of its female leadership. In traditional Vietnamese accounts, the Trung sisters committed suicide, jumping into a nearby river, as did a number of their followers. Now, although the revolt failed, it lived on in stories and legends to inspire later Vietnamese resistance to invaders, the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, and American alike. Men were reminded that women had led this rebellion, and to this day, temples, streets, and neighborhoods bear the name of the Trung sisters, and a yearly celebration in their honor coincides with International Women's Day. Usually depicted riding on war elephants and wielding swords, these two women were also represented, they also represent the more fluid gender roles that available to some Vietnamese women in comparison to the stricter patriarchy prevalent in China. Excuse me. All right, this is a map of classical China. The brief Qin dynasty brought unity to the heartland of Chinese civilization, And the much longer Han Dynasty extended its territorial reach southward toward Vietnam, east to Korea, and west into Central Asia. To the north lay the military confederacy of the nomadic Shan Yu. Now, based on the pattern in this map, why did the Han Dynasty expand to the west? The Han Dynasty's expansion to the west was likely born out of a desire to control the lucrative trade routes along the Silk Roads. Okay, consolidating the Roman and Chinese empires. Both empires defined themselves in universal terms. They both invested heavily in public works, claimed supernatural sanctions, but the deceased Roman emperors were seen as gods, and the Chinese emperor was seen as the son of heaven. Both absorbed a foreign religious tradition. We see the development of Christianity in the Roman Empire and the introduction of Buddhism in China by traders. The relationship with societies they governed. The Romans were always a minority in the empire. Ethnic Chinese had a much larger cultural heartland, and China actively assimilated non-Chinese people, but the Roman assimilation was much more gradual. The Roman Empire was more culturally fragmented. That meant cultural influence of Greece and Rome, and the religious traditions from the East. Now, the role of language differed in the two empires. Latin, the alphabetic language, gave rise to Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, helping to maintain separate identities. And Chinese characters, which represent words and ideas, could be read by all literate people, facilitating assimilation. Now, the Roman Empire's peoples maintained separate cultural identities far more than in China, and the bureaucracy is much more elaborate in China than it was in the Roman Empire. The Chinese Emperor Wu Di, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, established an academy to train officials based on the works of Confucius, and the Roman administration relied on regional elites and their formidable army. Both empires had marked effects on the environment. The Roman Empire experienced extensive deforestation and unprecedented levels of lead in the air, while China had substantial urban air population and soil erosion in the countryside. All right, Roman actors. This mosaic from Pompeii, likely created during the 1st century CE, depicts the staging of a theatrical production. Now, what cultural influence is demonstrated by this mosaic? The influence of Greek culture, specifically in the style of dress and the public interest in drama, is evident in this mosaic. All right, the collapse of empires. So, why did these two empires fall? Well, the Han Dynasty ended in 220 CE, and there's a traditional date for the fall of Western Rome as 476 CE, as the eastern half survived as the Byzantine Empire. And some common factors between the two, or reasons: their excessive size, overextension. They were just too expensive for the available resources. No great technological breakthrough to enlarge resources to help sustain growth. Tax evasion by large landowning families. The tax burden thus fell heavily onto the poor. Rivalry between the elite factions created instability. Epidemic disease, which affects any civilization. Threat from nomadic or semi-agricultural peoples on the frontier. China had was more successful in assimilating invaders than the Romans. And the effects of the imperial collapse. There's no centralized government and no more endemic conflict. Specifically in Rome, this led to the decline of urban life, a population decline, less cultivated area, a reduction of international trade, and vast insecurity throughout Europe. The most important difference between the collapse of the Han and Roman empires is what happened next. In China, after about 350 years of disorder, led to the creation of an imperial state, the Sui, Tang, and Sung dynasties. But in Europe, however, no large-scale imperial system has ever been successfully established in Western Europe since the Romans. So since the fall of Rome, there's never been another empire established in Europe. Now, why was China more successful in restoration? There's a greater homogeneity, a stronger bureaucratic tradition. Confucianism placed a strong value on political matters and harmonious relations between different groups. Agriculture was more productive, and metallurgy was far more advanced. Okay, here we have a picture of a Chinese museum. This Chinese stone relief from the 5th century CE depicts a celestial musician, a minor Buddhist deity, playing a pipa, a string instrument of Central Asian origin. So how could this image be used to illustrate the effects of trans-regional trade on China's culture? Well, this stone relief from China depicts a minor god in the Buddhist tradition, a religion that came from India, playing a musical instrument from Central Asia. And here we have the Anglo-Saxon treasure. This purse hinge, recovered from the royal gravesite at Sutton Hoo, one of the greatest hoards of Anglo-Saxon treasure ever found in England, is an exquisite piece of 7th century barbarian art that combines intricate gold work inlaid with gem-like garnets and glass. The paired images in the center depict birds of prey hunting, smaller birds, perhaps ducks maybe. The outer pair comprise men standing between beasts. Above are 3 plaques decorated with elaborate geometric patterns, which are a hallmark of Germanic art from this period. So what might a historian learn about Anglo-Saxon society based on this artifact? Well, you might think about the workmanship with specific metals, in this case gemstones, glass, and gold. You might also think about the functionality of this object, a purse hinge, and why it was buried with a human. Or you might be able to focus on the meaning of the birds depicted in their actions. You might also think about the cultural connections between this artwork and that of the Germanic tribes of the continent. And that concludes 3.2, Comparing Empires, the Roman and Chinese. I will see you guys next time.